How Peter overcame his gaming addiction and rebuilt his life with purpose. Peter was 19 years old and lived in a dark room, surrounded by empty energy drink cans, forgotten food crumbs, and the cold light of a monitor that almost never turned off. Outside, life was happening. People were maturing, studying, loving, growing up. But there, in that room, time seemed frozen. Peter was trapped. Not physically, but emotionally and psychologically. His world was that of online games. He spent more than 10 hours a day playing, often staying up all night in competitive matches, seeking small doses of dopamine with each digital victory. To those who knew him superficially, he was just the guy who really likes video games. But the truth was deeper and more painful. Peter was addicted. The game was no longer a diversion, it was a refuge, a silent and progressive escape from the reality that he didn't know how to face. It all started when he was still a teenager. Games offered him something the real world seemed to lack: control, immediate rewards, and the feeling of being good at something. While his self-esteem was eroded by academic failures, family estrangement, and constant comparisons with peers, in the virtual world he was someone. Someone respected, with status, with achievements. In the real world, Peter felt invisible. In the virtual world, he was recognized. His family began to notice changes. He became increasingly isolated, avoiding conversations, skipping meals, and neglecting studies and basic commitments. But no one knew how to help him, and Peter didn't know how to ask for help either. He told himself he could stop at any time, but when he tried, he would soon go back. There was always a new update, a new event in the game, a new reason to stay connected and disconnected from real life. The emptiness that Peter felt inside was deep, but he masked it with laughter in voice chats, with momentary victories, and with the constant denial that there was a real problem. It was easier to pretend that everything was under control than to face the pain of recognizing that he had lost his way in life. And it was in this state, exhausted, disconnected, and increasingly without perspective, that Peter's story begins. A story that is not only about games or addiction, but about escape, pain, identity, and, above all, about rebuilding. Because rock bottom is not the end. Sometimes, it is the first step towards a transformative climb. It was on a muggy Monday afternoon that everything started to fall apart. Peter had spent the entire weekend playing, practically without sleeping, without eating properly, and without leaving his room. He ignored all of his mother's messages, missed a family lunch on Sunday, and didn't even notice that the sunlight barely entered the room where he was. That Monday, however, something got out of his control. His cell phone rang. It was the college coordinator. Peter answered, irritated, thinking it was some bureaucratic issue. But the voice on the other end was cold and direct. "Peter, we need to talk. You've exceeded the maximum absence limit. Your withdrawal from the course is being processed." It was like being punched in the stomach. For weeks, he had ignored emails, alerts, and messages from the college secretary. He always put it off, believing that he would be able to make up for the classes, that he would find a way. But now it was too late. And for the first time, the reality he had avoided so strenuously had taken a heavy toll, a price he could no longer ignore. Peter hung up the phone and stood still. The game was still open, his character was still breathing in some digital arena, but Peter felt like his own body was numb. His head was spinning, his heart was beating fast, and a lump began to form in his throat. He felt ridiculous. A failure. How had he let this happen? How could someone lose control of their own life like that? It wasn't just the college dropout. It was what it symbolized. It was the last anchor that connected him to the world outside his bedroom. His parents, who were already frustrated with his behavior, were devastated. His mother cried, and it hit him in a way that no game defeat ever had. For the first time in a long time, Peter looked at himself in the mirror. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, his beard unshaven. He barely recognized his own image. The penny dropped. He wasn't just addicted to games. He was running away from life. And this escape now had a real, visible, undeniable cost. That was the moment of rupture. The pain, fear, and shame he felt that day served as a kind of rude awakening. It wasn't the turning point yet. He still had many ups and downs to go through, but it was the first glimpse of light in a dark room. For the first time, Peter began to wonder if there was another way. If it was possible, and if he had the courage to truly change. After the shock of being dropped from college, Peter woke up the next day determined that something had to change. He was still confused, emotionally exhausted, and with a weight on his chest that wouldn't go away, but he had made a decision. He would try to quit gaming. He closed the computer, deleted the shortcuts, unplugged the cables, and said to himself out loud, "It's over." But the problem was that it wasn't over. Not really. In the first 24 hours, Peter experienced something he had never felt so intensely: withdrawal. It wasn't just a desire to play, it was real anxiety. A restlessness in his body, insomnia, irritability. He tried to distract himself with videos, podcasts, short walks, but his mind always went back to the same place: the games. The mechanics, the challenges, the digital achievements. It was as if a part of his brain was screaming for dopamine. On the second day, he had a relapse. "I'm just going to log in to check the updates," he lied to himself. Half an hour later, he had been in a 3-hour session without interruption, as if nothing had changed. When he left, his eyes dry and his head throbbing, the shame returned with a vengeance. Peter felt like a failure. This cycle, attempt, relapse, guilt, repeated itself over and over again. And each new relapse was accompanied by a gnawing thought: maybe I'll never make it. The addiction seemed bigger than him. He felt small, weak, isolated. He didn't yet know that this kind of process is common, that most real change comes with a long period of internal resistance, repeated failures, and slow learning. But even when he failed, something was changing. Little by little, Peter began to identify the triggers. He realized that he relapsed more on days when he felt anxious or alone. That boredom was a powerful enemy. That games weren't just a pastime, they were an emotional escape. When he was faced with something difficult or uncomfortable, the urge to escape was almost automatic. That's when he started writing things down. Each relapse became a small entry in an old notebook. When it happened, what he felt, what he was thinking before. This didn't stop him from making mistakes again, but it gave him something he didn't have before: awareness. For the first time, Peter was looking the problem in the face. And even though he still fell, he now fell with more clarity and got up with more intention. During this time, he tried everything: uninstalling the games, setting passwords, asking his brother to hide the router. Many of these attempts seemed futile, but each one planted a seed. And most importantly, he didn't give up. He began to understand that changing wasn't about brute force, but about patience, strategy, and self-knowledge. These first few weeks were the hardest. Peter still didn't have a new purpose, he still didn't know what he would replace his addiction with. But he had taken the hardest step: he had started the process. And even though he stumbled, he was no longer the same. He was tired of the prison he was living in and willing, for the first time in a long time, to fight for his own freedom. For weeks, Peter struggled with the emptiness. He knew what he no longer wanted: to be dominated by games, but he had no idea what to replace it with. And that was one of the hardest parts. He had spent years living in a digital universe that offered constant rewards, clear goals, a sense of progress, and control. In the real world, nothing seemed as stimulating. But the mind needs focus. And without realizing it, Peter began to look for something that could replace that source of excitement. At first, he tried random things. He tried to learn how to cook, but he didn't have the patience. He read about photography, but the camera on his cell phone limited his attempts. He started following profiles of people who talked about healthy habits, but he felt that it was too far from his reality. He was still lost. It was during a sleepless night that something changed. While flipping through videos on YouTube to try to distract himself, Peter came across a documentary about game design. Ironic, considering his situation. But it wasn't a gameplay. It was a technical and philosophical dive into how games are built, how they affect the brain, and how their design influences human behavior. Peter was mesmerized. That morning, he realized that behind his addiction, there was also a genuine curiosity. He had never stopped to think about why games worked so well, how they managed to hold attention for so long, what was behind those design decisions. For the first time, he felt he could study games without being sucked into them. In the days that followed, Peter dove into it. He began studying game design, behavioral psychology, and the neuroscience of addiction. He downloaded and read academic papers, attended lectures, and looked for free courses. He was no longer playing games. He was understanding the mechanisms behind games. It was as if he were reversing logic. Before, he had been a prisoner of the system. Now, he was trying to understand it like an engineer dismantling a machine. This new interest gave him something valuable: direction. Even though he was still emotionally shaken and struggling with relapses, Peter now had a focus that made sense. It was a study that, in addition to being genuinely interesting, connected to his story. He had experienced the effects of that world firsthand and was now trying to decipher it. His curiosity was not abstract. It was existential. He needed to understand it in order to understand himself. Over time, this focus began to generate other positive side effects. He started writing down his reflections again, but this time in a more structured way. He created a small blog where he wrote about what he learned, without any great pretensions, just to organize his thoughts. He began to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. Peter was still far from a balanced life. He still felt alone, still dealt with anxiety, still failed. But now there was something new at stake. For the first time, he wasn't just running away from addiction. He was running towards something. And that was the beginning of the turnaround. After finding a new focus in his life, studying game design and the psychology behind games, Peter was excited, but also vulnerable. He had spent years structuring himself emotionally around virtual achievements, instant rewards, and dopamine cycles. Replacing all of that with a productive, long-term routine required more than momentary motivation. It required a system. It was then that he began to realize something essential. He didn't need to change his entire life at once. He just needed to win today. Inspired by books he read and personal development videos that were now part of his new content diet, Peter embraced a simple but powerful concept: the power of small victories. He understood that the brain, conditioned for immediate rewards, needs short and constant stimuli to stay engaged, and that the key was to recreate that outside of games, in reality. And so his minimal routine was born. Peter no longer woke up with a list of 20 impossible things to accomplish. He woke up with 3 simple goals. Study for 30 minutes on a topic related to your new focus. Write a paragraph reflecting on what you learned. Take a 10-minute walk outside. And that was it. It might seem like little, almost useless. But for him, it meant everything. Because at the end of the day, he could cross off those items. He could look back and say, "Today I won." It was a feeling he hadn't felt in a long time, one of control, of progress. And even though it was small, it was real. These small victories had a second function: to reduce the chance of relapse. Peter knew that the biggest trigger for returning to addiction was the feeling of failure, that nothing was working, that he was stuck. When the days went by without a single goal, anxiety would set in, his mind would sabotage itself, and video games would become a refuge. But when he completed his minimal routine, this trap was avoided. It was as if he was building a psychological shield to resist temptation. Over time, this structure expanded. He began to add new elements. He swapped walking for light jogging. He increased his study time. He started writing longer articles and posting on forums. But all of this only came after the minimal actions became habits. The logic was clear: before climbing, stabilize. This philosophy of the sustainable minimum was a turning point for Peter. Unlike before, when he made grand promises and failed in a few days, now he had a strategy that respected his limitations, his emotional moment, and his mental energy. And, most importantly, that did not require infinite willpower. He understood that discipline is not heroism, it is architecture. It is about building, day after day, small structures of victory that accumulate and, little by little, transform the landscape of your life. Even when motivation failed, and it did fail, the routine was there, like an anchor. That was how Peter began to leave the logic of constant relapse and enter a cycle of slow but constant construction. And that, for someone who had spent years being held hostage by impulses, was one of the greatest achievements possible. Peter grew up accustomed to living with his mind always occupied. There was no empty space between one stimulus and another. If he wasn't playing, he was watching videos about games. If he wasn't online with friends, he was browsing forums, consuming memes, game soundtracks, match highlights. The silence was uncomfortable. Stillness seemed like a mistake. Being alone with one's own thoughts was almost unbearable. This pattern, which seems harmless at first, has profound effects. Peter realized, already on his journey of change, that part of his addiction was not only due to the adrenaline of games, but also to emotional avoidance. He filled every moment with stimuli because he didn't want to face what was inside him: insecurity, fear of the future, frustrations, the guilt of having wasted so much time. And worst of all, a fragile identity built around digital achievements and ephemeral validations. But as his minimal routine began to create a more stable emotional foundation, he found himself facing something new. Moments of silence began to appear, and could no longer be ignored. And it was in this space that Peter began a new type of training: strategic solitude. Unlike loneliness, which is an unwanted absence of connection, solitude is the deliberate presence with oneself. It is the space in which you find yourself, without masks, without distractions, without performance. Peter started slowly. At first, he would just allow himself to sit on the porch in the morning for 10 minutes, without a cell phone or music, just observing the world around him. It was uncomfortable. His mind would get restless. But little by little, he learned to stay. Not to run away. To listen to what his body was saying, to recognize the thoughts that arose, to process emotions that had been bottled up for years. Over time, he extended these moments. He replaced a block of content consumption with solitary walks, without headphones. He started writing more, not texts for others, but dialogues with himself. In a worn notebook, he would write down fears, desires, memories that he had previously ignored. It was painful, but also liberating. For the first time, Peter was becoming intimate with himself. This process had profound effects. He realized that the more comfortable he became with silence, the less compulsive he became. The triggers that used to make him run to the video game, anxiety, frustration, boredom, no longer had the same weight, because he had learned to stay with it, to metabolize these emotional states, instead of running away from them. In addition, solitude led him to redefine his identity. He stopped being just a former addict trying to escape the past, and became a young man rebuilding himself, discovering what really matters. He began to recognize his own values, not those imposed by algorithms or comparisons. He discovered that he liked to learn slowly, that he enjoyed creating, and that he felt good about taking care of himself. This kind of discovery only happens when we silence the noise. Peter understood that true freedom was not just being away from games, but feeling good even without constant stimuli. It was being able to stay in a room alone and still feel whole. This, for him, was one of the greatest achievements of his journey and a powerful antidote against future relapses. Because when you learn to be self-sufficient, to need less to feel good, addiction loses its power. And peace, previously seen as boring, becomes the most profound of rewards. As much as Peter was already creating new habits, following a healthier routine and learning to live with silence, there was still a persistent feeling of doubt inside him. It was as if, somewhere in the corner of his mind, a voice whispered, "You're just fooling yourself. This won't last." This type of self-sabotage is common in people trying to break addictions, especially addictions that become part of their identity. Peter didn't see himself as someone who had changed yet. He only saw the effort, but he didn't see the change. It was then that a seemingly trivial moment became the great emotional turning point in his life. It was a Sunday morning. Peter's younger sister, only 9 years old, came into the room with a drawing in her hand. On it, she had drawn a smiling figure holding a pan, wearing a blue t-shirt, messy hair, and a caption written in crooked letters, "My brother is the hero of our house." Peter smiled, but he didn't immediately understand the weight of it. It was only when she explained, "Because now you always wake up early, make delicious food and help me with my homework, and Mommy said you're different," that he felt something break inside him. It was real. For the first time, He saw through someone else's eyes the reflection of his own change. It was as if all his effort finally gained body, voice, face. At that moment, Peter no longer saw himself as the addicted boy trying to get better. He saw himself as someone new. Someone who had come out of the depths of despair and was, in fact, climbing, step by step, one step at a time. He cried. Not a cry of sadness, but of relief. As if the tension of years could finally drain from his body. At that moment, he truly believed that change was possible. Not as an abstract ideal, but as a concrete path, paved with small habits, overcome setbacks, and now, recognition. This emotional shift was a turning point, because no motivation compares to the feeling of proving to yourself that you are capable. From that moment on, Peter's discipline was no longer fueled by guilt or fear of the past, but by genuine pride in the present. He had built something. He had a story to tell, a past to be honored and a future to be conquered. And most importantly, he realized that true change does not happen all at once, like a bolt of lightning. It happens silently until the day someone or something holds a mirror in front of you and you finally recognize yourself. With a clearer mind and a real desire for change, Peter began to explore not only practical strategies, but also new ways of thinking. It was in this process that he first came into contact with Stoic philosophy, something that, until then, he had imagined to be just a set of old and distant ideas, with no real-world application. But Stoicism surprised him. It was direct, practical, realistic, and, above all, powerful. One of the first concepts that touched him deeply was the dichotomy of control, taught by Epictetus. Some things are within our control, others are not. Peter realized that he had spent years trying to control the uncontrollable, other people's opinions, family problems, friends' behavior, the difficulties of the world. And at the same time, he had neglected what was completely under his responsibility, his habits, his choices, his attitudes toward life. This insight was liberating. He began to list what was within his circle of influence, his daily discipline, his sleep time, his diet, his focus on studies, the content he consumed, the people he chose to spend time with. All of this, as difficult as it was his choice. It wasn't easy, but it was possible. Peter also learned to practice emotional detachment in the face of life's ups and downs, another Stoic pillar. This didn't mean being cold or insensitive, but rather not letting yourself be destroyed by that which cannot be changed. When he got a bad grade in college, instead of wallowing in guilt or numbing himself with games like he used to, he asked himself, what about this is in my control? If the answer was study harder or ask the teacher for help, that's what he focused on. Stoic philosophy offered Peter something that no amount of superficial motivational advice could, a system of thought that anchored him in difficult times. An internal code of conduct that he could apply every day, especially in moments of doubt, temptation, or relapse. More than a change in behavior, Stoicism planted the seed of an inner transformation in Peter. He began to realize that true freedom does not lie in doing whatever you want, but in wanting what is worthwhile. And this clarity, little by little, became the basis of his new identity. One of the most challenging stages of Peter's journey was filling the void left by the absence of games. For years, they had been his escape, his solace, and his comfort zone. Giving them up created an emotional and practical gap in his routine. Free time, once filled with endless online games, now felt threatening, bringing with it boredom, anxiety, and the urge to relapse. Peter realized that if he wanted to truly change, it wasn't enough to just cut out the addiction. He had to replace it. The first strategy he adopted was time redirection. He started with a simple approach. For every hour he felt like playing, he would plan an alternative activity with personal value. At first, these activities were modest, like walking around the neighborhood listening to a podcast, organizing your room, or preparing a healthy meal. The idea was to reprogram your brain to find satisfaction in actions that truly contribute to your growth. Then he took it a step further. Peter decided to delve into projects that had a deeper meaning. One of them was learning to play the guitar, an old childhood dream that had always been postponed due to lack of time, something that games constantly consumed. With the guitar, he found a new kind of challenge, Not instantaneous, not immediately rewarding like games, but built with effort, patience, and real progress. In addition, Peter got involved in volunteer activities in a social project at the university. He started helping in workshops with vulnerable teenagers, and over time, he realized something transformative. Teaching, listening, and serving others not only gave purpose to his time, but also healed parts of him that addiction had weakened: his empathy, his sense of worth, his connection to the real world. Another key step was creating daily rituals. Peter discovered that filling his morning with small victories, like making his bed, taking a cold shower, writing down his goals for the day, gave him a sense of control that carried over into the rest of the day. Not only did this keep him from the temptation of gaming, it also cemented a different identity, that of someone who acts with intention. And perhaps most importantly, Peter understood that the human mind craves challenge, reward, and purpose. Games had provided these, but in an illusory way. By replacing games with real-world challenges, learning, building, serving, creating, he began to feel truly engaged. No longer as someone who was running away from life, but as someone who was living it consciously. As he overcame his addiction, Peter discovered a hard but essential truth: progress is not linear. Even with all his willpower, new routines, and motivation, there were times when he fell. Relapses happened. And at first, each one was devastating. After days, sometimes weeks, of abstinence, he would find himself back in a marathon of games that lasted until dawn. The feeling afterward was always the same: guilt, shame, and the feeling that all his progress had been wasted. But it was at this point that a crucial shift began to happen. Instead of continuing to harbor this guilt, Peter decided to look at his relapses with a different perspective, a compassionate but strategic perspective. First, he understood that a relapse is not a failure. It is part of the process of transformation. This understanding did not come from a simple motivational phrase, but from observing the pattern. He noticed that after each relapse, he always came back to square one with greater awareness. He began to better identify his triggers. He noticed the signs of emotional exhaustion, lack of sleep, and lack of purpose in his days. Each setback brought a lesson embedded in it. He began to write all of this down in a personal journal, something that became a tool for clarity in the most vulnerable moments. Peter also began to apply a technique he learned from a therapist: active self-compassion. Instead of punishing himself emotionally, he began to treat himself as he would a dear friend who was going through the same thing. He wrote letters to himself after each relapse, not to justify, but to understand. Phrases like, "You're trying and that's brave," or "What can you learn from this time?" began to shape his approach to dealing with mistakes. In addition, he adopted what he called an emotional containment plan. Knowing that relapses could happen, he prepared in advance. He set immediate actions for the following days. One of these plans involved leaving the house the next day, meeting a friend, or going to a cafe to study, places where he wouldn't have easy access to games. This shortened the time between a fall and a recovery, and prevented a slip from turning into a full-blown regression. Another effective strategy was to bring other people into his journey. Peter told 2 trusted friends about his struggle. They weren't controlling friends, but they were trustworthy enough to call or text him when he disappeared. Just knowing that someone was paying attention to his progress brought accountability and encouragement. Over time, Peter understood that real discipline isn't about never falling, but about learning to get up quickly, with more wisdom and less drama. Relapses stopped being monsters and started being teachers. With each one, he became stronger, more aware, and more committed to rebuilding himself. The real turning point in Peter's story was not when he stopped playing games completely, but when he learned to relate healthfully to technology, leisure activities, and, above all, to himself. After going through all the difficult phases, denial, guilt, relapses, Peter reached a point where he began to realize that he didn't need to be radically anti-technology to have a balanced life. The real challenge was to control the impulse, not completely eliminate the object of pleasure. This transformation began when he exchanged the logic of all or nothing for that of conscious use. He no longer saw games or the internet as absolute villains, but rather as tools, which could be beneficial or destructive, depending on how they were used. He established simple but non-negotiable rules. Do not play alone, never play late at night, and avoid games that exploited addictive mechanisms such as random rewards and infinite cycles. He began to prefer cooperative, short games, with a beginning, middle, and end, experiences that offered leisure without capturing it. Peter also created a system of real balance between obligation and pleasure. He only played, or watched movies, or browsed social networks after he had accomplished his goals for the day. Not as a reward in the strict sense of behaving to win, but as a way of teaching his own brain that pleasure is more enjoyable when it comes after achievement. This was essential to restructuring his mental patterns. One of the biggest signs of his transformation was the change in how he filled his time. The void that was previously filled with hours and hours in front of a screen was replaced by habits that generated emotional, physical, and even financial returns. Peter started practicing guided meditation in the morning, read personal development books, went back to drawing, something he loved when he was a child, and even volunteered to give digital literacy workshops at an NGO in his city. Leisure now was not an escape, it was self-care. Technology also became his ally. He used apps for meditation, to track the time spent using his cell phone, and even to study with more focus, using techniques like Pomodoro. Apps that were once compulsively accessed, such as YouTube and TikTok, were now restricted by blockers that he set himself, often with passwords that only a trusted friend had. Peter also realized that the most important thing was not just to change habits, but to redefine his identity. He stopped seeing himself as a gaming addict trying to quit, and started seeing himself as someone who is disciplined, in control of himself, who chooses where he puts his attention. This change in identity was profound. He was no longer the boy who ran away from reality, he was the man who built it, step by step, with intention. And with that, something powerful happened. Peter regained his sense of freedom. What had once seemed like a prison, the absolute control of algorithms and instant pleasure, was now a space of choices. He could turn off his cell phone, go for a walk in the park, cook calmly, or watch an episode of a series, without fear of losing control. The new Peter no longer defined himself by abstinence, but by self-control. That was the real victory, not stopping playing but stopping losing himself. Peter's journey from a young man consumed by gaming addiction to building a conscious and intentional life carries powerful lessons that can serve as a compass for anyone struggling with a destructive cycle, whether it's technology, procrastination, self-sabotaging habits, or the constant feeling that they're wasting their own potential. The first lesson is, real change doesn't start with willpower, it starts with awareness. Peter only started to change when he realized, with pain and sincerity, that he was wasting his life. The moment he saw his reflection, exhausted, pale, and distant from reality, was the beginning of the transformation. For many, this moment can come in different forms: a fight with a loved one, a health crisis, a rejection, an inexplicable emptiness. The point is not how the penny drops, but what we do with this awareness. The second lesson is, no one changes their life by trying to change everything at once. Peter didn't transform himself overnight. He started with small, consistent actions: getting out of bed without checking his cell phone, taking a cold shower, leaving the house for a walk. These seemingly simple steps are the true builders of identity, because they are the ones that begin to tell the brain, I am someone who takes care of myself. And this, over time, becomes stronger than any temptation. The third lesson is that discipline is not rigidity. It is freedom that has been earned. Peter learned to use technology consciously, not by imposition, but by decision. He developed a new relationship with pleasure, with free time, with work, and with challenges. There was no longer a desperation to escape life. There was a real desire to live it. This is perhaps the most profound change a person can achieve. The fourth lesson is about identity. Peter stopped seeing himself as a failure trying to fix himself and started seeing himself as a creator of himself. This made all the difference. When change comes from a place of self-compassion and respect, it holds up much more strongly. He forgave himself for his setbacks, understood that the process would be tortuous and slow, and still kept going. This is not weakness, this is courage. Finally, Peter's story reminds us of something essential. We are stronger than we think, but we cannot overcome it alone. The help of his sister, the support of his therapist, the exchange of experiences with other young people, all of this formed the network that sustained his climb. Change is possible, but we need to allow ourselves to ask for help, to share the pain, and to accept that vulnerability is the soil in which true strength grows. Peter's life today isn't perfect, but it's conscious, meaningful, and purposeful. He hasn't just rebuilt his routine, he's rebuilt himself. And that's perhaps the biggest message of this video. No matter how low you feel right now, it's possible to climb. You just have to take the first step.